Hi, I'm Dr. Sharna Oltman, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Science and Pseudoscience of Mental Health podcast. My guests are scientists, clinicians, activists, all of whom are making really impactful contributions to both our understanding and our support of mental health. At the same time, they're helping to debunk the pseudoscience that has kept the mental health system locked into really narrow, pharmaceutically driven treatment protocols. My inaugural guest is Dr. Zach Bush. He is one of the few triple board certified MDs in the country. He has expertise in endocrinology and metabolism, in internal medicine, and also in hospice and palliative care. Dr. Bush had a very prestigious academic career based in cancer research and a successful conventional medical practice. But about 10 years ago, he arrived at what was for him a really challenging conclusion, and that was that his pharmaceutically based treatment protocols were not only not helping his patients get well, but he felt that they were actively harming them. So he walked away from his research, from his practice. He moved to rural Virginia in the middle of a food desert and opened up a clinic with a focus on the medicinal properties of plants. Today, he runs a really interesting, innovative, integrative medical clinic in Charlottesville, but he also heads an outstanding team of researchers who are at the forefront of epigenetics and microbiome research. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today, Dr. Bush. I was really keen for you to be the inaugural guest on the Science and Pseudoscience of Mental Health series for Mad in America, because I really think of you as a really visionary, big picture thinker, and I love the way you, bring so much to the macro picture of the connection between planetary health and human health, and the micro picture of epigenetics and the microbiome. And you prove out your theory in the laboratory with an amazing team of scientists, but also in the clinic with your patients. And in the process, you're developing a really innovative and impactful approach to healthcare and challenging big pharma and conventional medicine. So I think to start, it would be really helpful if you could just give us a brief, I know this is near impossible to do a brief overview, but if you could, of the concepts of the microbiome, like the concept of epigenetics, the reason that the gut is so central, of such central importance to our health, and its connection in turn to the immune system and the barrier systems, including the blood-brain barrier. So if you could kind of just do like a brief primer, that would be amazing.
Okay, so we'll start with the microbiome, I think was the request there. And so the microbiome is an ecosystem that lives in and around the human being. It is composed not just of bacteria, but also of fungi, parasites, viruses, and the like. And this ecosystem is massive in comparison to the biology that we hold as humans. So it's recognized that just the bacteria alone outnumber us 10 to 1 on the human body, in and around, and also in our tissues. It's now understood that bacteria dwell in the breast or in the prostate or in our solid organs, as well as within the human gut lining and on our skin and every pore, our nasal sinuses and the mouth. All of these structures are covered in teeming ecosystems of bacteria and fungi. And the interesting thing about the microbiome is it has the capacity to balance. If it has enough information and it has enough, connection to its own nature, the microbiome has the capacity to balance these tens of thousands of species of bacteria with millions of species of fungi, with hundreds of thousands of species of parasites. So we have this massive ecosystem that's all working in a very coherent and coordinated fashion. You throw into that then an antibiotic, and you can see the incredible disruption that we cause in the fabric of the biology in which we live. You've perhaps grown a garden, or you know somebody who's grown a garden, and you have a sense that if they don't take care of their soil, if they don't have enough moisture and water content in the soil, they don't have enough compost and all of that, and the nutrient in the soil, their plants are going to die. We live just as the plant does on our organic soil. Our soil happens to be that of our gut and of the nutrient delivery of our microbiome. And so as we kill the ecosystem in our soil, our plants are damaged, the soil is damaged. As we take antibiotics in our food, in our water systems, in our prescriptions from our physicians, we are decimating the very fabric of the way in which our life springs out of the soil. And life is continuously needing that nurture, right? You can't just take care of the plant until it's a foot high and then stop taking care of it. You need that soil to be made, healthy and maintained throughout the life cycle of the plant. If you start aging, you know that your soil is starting to have a decrement. The aging process should not look like a decline by age 2, which is currently what we see. Mitochondria start to die off by age 2 as humans now. And so we're seeing this decrement of life and the life-giving soil very, very early in life. By age 28, we all have measurable dementia. And so we have this really fast decline happening as the microbiome is challenged. The next you talked about there was, the relationship of that microbiome to the gut lining and the, intelligence of this barrier system, not just of the gut lining, but the blood-brain barrier, the vascular barrier systems, the kidney tubules, and the like. And our group has been really working with some of the most profound science in this area because of the opportunity that we had to start to extract these molecules that are made by the bacteria and fungi in the microbiome, extract those from fossil soils and put those into the human intestinal environment under the microscope, and then ultimately, just more recently, the human blood-brain barrier. And we've come to find out that the bacteria and the fungi, not in their organisms themselves, but instead in the metabolites, these carbon molecules that function as a communication network, dictate and control the ability of the human cell to respond to injury, to prevent injury, and all of this. And so that's the relationship then to that barrier system. And as that starts to suffer due to the loss of the microbiome, we start to lose our self-identity at the core level. We start to lose the identity of outside and inside. Outside that barrier is the outside world. Inside is my immune system and human biology. As that system erodes and we start to lose those boundaries, then we develop chronic inflammation where we're attacking everything. We develop autoimmune conditions where we're stimulated to attack anything that looks foreign. And if we have enough disruption of our understanding of self versus non-self, we start to react to our own organ systems, and we kill our thyroid gland or our pancreas or whatever organ is under attack, or we erode our joints with rheumatoid arthritis. All of these processes are these chronic inflammatory states that have developed due to this, widespread damage to the tight junction system and the leak that's now going to come out of that situation. How does that impact then the bigger organism? You asked me to speak towards, the impact on emotion and those things. As you start to lose self-identity, your ability to understand the source of fear, guilt, emotional trauma in your life is undermined, and you become, much more, I think, egocentric in the sense that you start to lose the context of who you are by this kind of erosion of that self-identity at the cellular level, and you start to be prone to collapse. You're prone to, kind of collapsing into that fear and paranoia of I'm attacked, nobody nurtures me, nobody's loving me, nobody understands me. That kind of fear paradigm that we're all prone to, and we can all go, even in our healthiest states, we can find ourselves at any point in the week kind of slipping into that more negative thought process, that sense of why the hell am I here? Last week I felt like I knew my purpose, and this week, all of that seemed to dissolve, and now I don't know why I'm working so hard. What the hell is going on? Like, we can so quickly, lose that grounding, and it's going to come back again and again to what is the relationship between the microbiome, the protein synthesis of our extracellular matrix and the tight junctions and the barrier systems, to the neurotransmitters themselves. And we now know that the bacteria in the gut, a very specific segment of species of those microbiome, have to be present and touching the endocrine cells in our gut lining that makes serotonin and dopamine. If that bacteria is killed by an antibiotic or our food chain, we now can't make serotonin. If we now ingest glyphosate, Roundup, alcohol, any number of things that kill the tight junctions, we now develop a leak and inflammation. Not only are we not making serotonin and dopamine, we have inflammation in our brains and in our immune systems, and we quickly erode biologic wellness, and we slip into that depression, anxiety, sense of self-worthlessness, all of these things that start to emotionally emerge from the matrix of this chaotic system that's losing its barriers.
So thank you so much for that, kind of that overview, that big picture. So I'm guessing that the vast majority of people who are listening today have heard about Monsanto's product Roundup, which you referenced, and its active ingredient, glyphosate. But sometimes you kind of, know it, but you don't really know it. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about why you focus so heavily on this product specifically. And I've also heard you kind of tie it pretty directly to the autism epidemic that we're seeing in children today. So if you could just speak a little bit more about the specific harms of Roundup and its connection to the various mental health crises that we're experiencing today, that would be awesome.
Sure. So the active ingredient, as mentioned, is glyphosate. This is a molecule that is made from the backbone of an amino acid, which is a naturally occurring building block for the proteins that we build our human body from. And that glycine backbone is then tagged with a phosphate group and then a carboxyl group to create an amine on the other end. We end up with this molecular family called an organophosphate. And that organophosphate is a chemical that was initially patented by a gentleman in Japan as a chelating agent, and that was 1959. Did not get put into the marketplace because it's a pretty toxic chemical, and so didn't get put into the marketplace. And then in the mid-1970s, Monsanto was actually developing chemicals for cleaning out industrial piping systems, sewer systems, and the like. And so they purchased the patent on this glyphosate molecule, and we're using it as a pipe cleaner, and it acts to tear minerals and stuff away from the lining of the pipe to open up clogged pipes that have been mineralized. And so the issue that they found, though, is that as soon as that pipe emptied on the other side of the water system, it killed all of the plant life and organisms in the streams and everything. And so they suddenly realized they had something that was, damaging the green stuff. And that's now, recognized to be, the same process that they would have recognized in the other organophosphate that was present in the 1970s in big amounts, which was Agent Orange. Agent Orange was the chemical we were transporting over to Vietnam to defoliate the jungles. And so we were spraying from planes vast amounts of organophosphates to kill the jungle foliage so that we could see the Viet Cong and kill them more effectively. And so it was this warfare tool initially to defoliate that then became a more mild chemical, if you will, in the form of glyphosate or Roundup, that they figured, well, if we can't market it as a pipe cleaner, then maybe we can go ahead and market it as a weed killer. And so they got permission to do that in the late 70s, and by the mid 80s, of course, it became a consumer product called Roundup. And Roundup, unfortunately, is far more toxic than just the glyphosate itself. It's got a bunch of surfactants and other chemicals in there. There's 16 other compounds that are toxic in the final product of Roundup. And so you develop this chemical that we spray weeds and that kills them within a few hours. And so we have this toxin, and it starts to be distributed to the homeowners who don't like weeding, and they're taught to spray dandelions, which are kind of cancer magic, anti-cancer superfoods. And so we're killing our dandelions with this Roundup chemical, and it starts to, unfortunately, get into the ecosystem. And the way in which that happens is that this molecule, which is unique to this family of toxins, is very water soluble. Most toxins that are derived in nature are fat soluble rather than water soluble. When you live on a planet that's 70% water, and mammals and all of the other eukaryotic biology on Earth being 70% water, it seems like a really bad idea to add a chemical that's water soluble that can then cross all those boundaries and get into every living organism to do its damage. But that's exactly what we did. So we took a water soluble toxin and we started spraying it into our yards, onto our driveways, to kill the dandelions and the weeds and the cracks and everything else. And of course that washed down into our sewers, which of course is the water system for the next town down the road. And so we started drinking glyphosate and Roundup in the 80s, and then by 1992, they developed techniques to start to sell this to farmers in mass for crop treatments. And so in 1992, they developed the ability to sell this as a desiccant rather than a weed killer. Desiccant means a drying agent, and so they had farmers in northern climates spraying their wheat with Roundup to kill it prematurely, and so that it would dry quickly so they could harvest it before the crop was damaged by storms that may be coming in, or fall coming on. And of course that allowed farmers in lower latitudes to actually start killing the wheat prematurely so they could actually grow 2 seasons of wheat rather than 1 and things like this. And so it accelerated the killing of the wheat. Of course, if you look back in time, you realize it was the same year that we started to develop a marked increase in the reactivity of the human gut to gluten in that wheat product. And as we've turned out to try to really delineate the real details of now in our labs in the last couple of years, we've been able to show that there's this huge synergy between gluten and glyphosate, and you don't get gluten sensitivity unless the gut lining has really been exposed in large amount to this glyphosate. And so we triggered sensitivity to gluten and other food compounds by adding glyphosate chemicals to that food before it delivered to the flour that would become our bread. And people have experienced this. Severe gluten sensitive patients will go over to Europe and eat a croissant and be blown away that they have no brain fog, no gut stuff, and they tolerate it completely fine. And somehow their gluten sensitivity went away. Well, they don't really have gluten sensitivity. They have glyphosate sensitivity, which is what all of us have. And so glyphosate is this kind of predisposing molecule. Then you fast forward to 1996, 4 years later, with the debut of the Monsanto Roundup Ready seeds for corn and soybean that were genetically modified to be able to be sprayed directly with Roundup. And so now we have wheat, corn, and soybean, and then ultimately the sugar beet as the 4 main staples in our country as staple crops being sprayed with a single chemical that disrupts the microbiome first. It actually functions as an antibiotic. And so it has been patented as antibiotic and kills fungi as well. It does all kinds of things to the microbiome. It can kill parasites, can kill worms, all kinds of things. A single spraying of Roundup in a field, we've been told now by the farmers we're working with, can kill 50% of the worms in a single application. And earthworms are obviously one of the most important parts of that soil ecosystem. And so it's extremely toxic life or chemical to all of life at every level. The plant, the microorganisms, the macroorganisms, all of them dying very quickly under a single application of this. And now imagine the entire farm system spraying this. And of course, it's not going to stay on the farm because it's water soluble. So as soon as we have rain or irrigation happen, it ends up not in the soil, it ends up in the water system. The water system that collects the vast majority of the Roundup sprayed in the United States from an agriculture standpoint, of course, is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River collects all of the water from Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Missouri, all these states within the northern and Midwest. We end up in one water system accumulating all of the Roundup, all of the fossil fertilizers and the rest into one water system. It's not surprising that's now the most horrible zone for life to exist in. As the Mississippi empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, we kill all microorganisms and fish life and everything else, and there's a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi that's now the size of Rhode Island and growing every day because we're dumping more and more of these chemicals out into that water system, killing the algae, killing the microorganisms in the coral, bleaching out the coral. Same thing is happening into the Great Barrier Reef. Australia went crazy with glyphosate in around 2007, and have been more steeped in it than even the United States over the last decade, and they're killing the coral reefs there. And so we've got this massive decimation of life on Earth from our chemical farming, and it absolutely should be illegal. And I think that the rise of consciousness is happening enough that I fully anticipate that it will be illegal in the next decade. The question is, how high of a toll are we going to have to pay in the form of our children's health before we are willing to make these jumps as consumers and as, people who vote their representatives into office? We have to make this the central part of human policy, because it's about human life and our survival. 1 in 3 males is now infertile in the United States. 1 in 4 women is infertile in the United States. It's direct correlation with our chemical farming. So we have got to stop this if we're going to survive as a species.
And again, thank you so much for that. If you could tie our use of glyphosate and our also abuse of antibiotics in general. I know glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic, so it's also an antibiotic. But if you could tie it to the just really shocking statistics that we're seeing around autism in children today, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, even before we get to the science, the public health statistics are so strikingly correlated with the debut of this chemical as it's impossible to ignore. In 1975, the rate of autism was 1 in 5,000 children in the United States. In 1976, we started to see a slow increase. By the 1980s, we were starting to see a rapid increase. By 1990s, we were seeing almost a near vertical increase. And then by 2012 to 2015, in that short 3-year period, we doubled our rates of autism in a single 3-year period, from 1 in 88 children to 1 in 44. And just now with 2016 numbers, 2017 hasn't even been counted yet, but 2016 already at 1 in 36. So we are marching so fast towards this reality that 1 in 3 children will have autism in the United States by 2035 at our current trajectory. 1 in 3 children. That statistic, is devastating from a humanity standpoint, from a health statistic. But if nothing else moves you, then the money should, because if we cannot, and nor can any economy on the planet, handle that burden of disease in our children. And at the same time, we've had this epidemic of cancer in our adults, with now 50% of American males diagnosed with cancer before they die. I think the number is 49% at last publication. That was 2 years ago, so I think we've well surpassed that now. But 50% of males now, you fast forward to 2035, and it's likely we're going to have 70% of the adult population with cancer and 1 in 3 children with autism. We can't. That's unfeasible as a nation. We will be bankrupt, and we will not be productive. And so we will not be a productive group. We will be a sick and diseased community that's pouring money into somebody else's pocket to keep our medical system alive. China might be the one pouring all the money in to keep our chemotherapy flowing. And so it's just an incredible decimation that is correlating with this advent of 1976 really being the bigger debut of Monsanto's Roundup. And then every year that we sprayed more crops, we see the trajectory of autism go up.
Right. So just to play devil's advocate, just to really actually to amplify what you're saying, some critics of the statistics that you just presented on autism might say, well, we're just getting better at diagnosing it, or we've so generalized the term, these are just quirky kids who shouldn't be labeled with, and I think that mostly comes from people who haven't worked directly with autistic kids, who can sort of dismiss it in that way. So if you could just speak to that briefly, that kind of critique, which I'm sure you've heard.
That argument has existed across all of the epidemics of disease that we have currently. You look at the trajectory of cancer. We keep being told that cancer is a genetic disease. Well, it can't be a genetic disease because we see this linear increase happening, doubling of cancer over a 25-year period in the United States. That can't happen if it's a genetic disease. This has to be an environmental disease process for us to change the demographics of cancer. It turns out that the highest death of cancer was in the Northwest and the Northeast for all of the history of us keeping track of the demographics of cancer death in the United States. And then suddenly in a 12-year period, we completely reversed that map, and the highest cancer rates are now at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And so that we completely reversed the whole epidemiology of cancer in just 15 years. That should be impossible if our science was right about the mechanisms and pathophysiology of cancer. Ultimately, it's the chemical environment that's correlating with our patterns of disease, the rates of disease. Now, cancer, you can argue, well, we're just getting better at diagnosing it compared to 1975, because now we have CAT scans and MRIs and all these fancy equipment to look pure inside the human body and find cancer earlier. I would totally agree with that. I would say there has been a bias of, cancer rate kind of diagnostic capacity that overemphasized the shift between 1975 and 1995. In those 20 years, we developed all that technology that would help us diagnose it sooner. Between 1995 and 2015, no change in our diagnostic criteria and technology in cancer. We're still using the digital MRI. We're still using the mammograms. We're still using the CT and MRIs for the rest. We have PET scans. All of these things have been very static over the last 20 years. And yet during that time, we've seen the steepest climb of cancer rates. And of course, we're now seeing cancer in incredible amounts in lymphoma, leukemias, and brain tumors in children. That never got missed. You don't miss leukemia and lymphoma in children. They die of that. And so, we have so much obvious stuff that we can't just chalk up to, oh, we're just diagnosing it better. When it comes to autism, I think you're spot on. Anybody who makes the argument that we are diagnosing autism, more accurately, or we loosen the diagnosis or the criteria, they haven't met an autistic person. We didn't miss this in 1975. We didn't miss that the kid went from verbal to suddenly nonverbal, can't make eye contact, and is so inconsolable that it strikes its head against the wall for 4 or 5 hours a day, to the point where it's got a big old knot on his forehead from 4 years of hitting his head against the wall. We didn't miss that kind of stuff in 1975. You don't need a CT or MRI to tell you you've got an autistic child. You need to be a parent. You see your child miss all of its milestones suddenly, and it can't crawl right, it can't walk, and years behind its peers. That we didn't miss that as parents, let alone doctors, in the 1970s and 80s. We have an epidemic at hand, and anybody who would argue against that is 100% part of the problem. The biggest part of the problem you can be is keep denying that there's a problem. And so I would challenge any physician and scientist to wake up and go meet your nephew and niece that has autism, because I guarantee you are 1 degree of separation from autism right now. You cannot find a family that's not being affected by autism now. And if you don't call it autism, then it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's sleep disorder, it's precocious puberty, it's anxiety, major depression in children, it's leukemia, lymphoma, brain tumors in children. And so we have so accelerated this disease process. 46% of children in the United States now have a chronic disease diagnosis. And there's a lot of those that haven't even been diagnosed yet, that are just sitting there suffering without the diagnosis. And so we have sick children. You ask any school nurse, how many EpiPens did you have on the shelf in 1985? Maybe 1. Now you go in, they have to have they've developed these fancy boards that all the EpiPens click into with the kid's name and a specific allergy, because there's so many kids that are allergic to their environment now because they have no barrier. They've destroyed the barrier system, and everything they eat goes zipping right into their immune system and cause a reaction. And so it's, there's just such an enormous collective ignorance happening in the medical field right now that I think is finally starting to collapse. When I started lecturing on this stuff, 2010, 2012, it fell on deaf ears. By 2015, I was starting to get so damn busy traveling to speak to everybody, because everybody wanted to know. Everybody knew there was a problem. Now I could be speaking 360 days a year all over the world if I wanted to. Everybody is starting to wake up, including the science community, that we have a serious freaking problem on our hands. And if we don't turn this around, even our politicians are realizing we have an insoluble financial situation.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So another issue that I wanted to discuss with you is that in psychiatry, and I know this is also true in medicine in general, that the treatment of choice in psychiatry and in the sort of mental health system is a psychiatric medication. It's not the treatment of last resort, it's the treatment of choice. And it's usually prescribed as part of a kind of a polypharmacy regimen. So it's a kind of a drug cocktail of some, mixture of antidepressants, stimulants, anti-anxiety medication, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants that get rebranded as mood stabilizers. And with each iteration of the DSM, Psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we have more and more of these kind of narrow silos of diagnosis. And I've heard you speak about both of these kind of related issues, the overuse of pharmaceuticals. I've heard you talk about your concern for the heavy use of stimulants with millions of kids today, and the ways in which these really narrow diagnostic labels sometimes remove us from the root cause of the individual's suffering or illness rather than elucidating. So if you could kind of speak to these kind of connected trends of more and more narrow diagnostic categories leading to more and more pharmaceuticals, especially like around the psychiatric drugs like stimulants.
Yeah, so part of my background that I don't get to talk about very often was before I went into my endocrinology and cancer research, I was really interested in neuroplasticity. And so by the time I was wrapping up medical school, I decided I wanted to focus on the area of a field called psychoneuroendocrinology. And it was the collision of how hormones control the neurologic system that would kind of be the underpinnings of either psychological health or disease. And so my first grant proposals and research proposals I wrote with Philip Gold at the NIH around this topic of psychoneuroendocrinology. And at this time in the late 1990s, we were starting into a very exciting period in the decade of the 2000 to 2010. That decade became known as the decade of the brain. We learned more about the human brain in that decade than ever known, and probably ever will be discovered again. So really exciting decade. And at the beginning of that process, we were starting to realize that the human brain was so plastic, changing all the time, neurons reconnecting and lysing their connections all the time, very, very plastic. And we found out that neurons could be born. We thought up until that time that you're born with your brain, and from that moment on, you have a decrease in number of neurons and you got what you got. Now we know that there's stem cells that can rebirth neurons all the time, and that your whole brain might even turn over every 7 or 8 years. And so there's this huge plasticity that has this potential for healing in the brain. So that was kind of my interest in underpinnings back in the late 90s. And now you fast forward to the last 5 years of my life to find out that you can't have a neurologic or endocrine event without the bacteria in the microbiome. And this is why the polypharmacy that you talk of is such a chasing after the wind, is it's not getting anywhere near the root cause of the situation as to our current understanding of what the situation is. And so back in the 1990s, when the big debut of Prozac and the big SSRI serotonin reuptake inhibitor class of antidepressants, that was an amazing time where we thought we had found a magic bullet for depression. And because it increases the amount of serotonin available in the synapse. And I said that carefully. It's not the amount of serotonin we increase. It doesn't make you make more serotonin. It simply blocks the uptake of the serotonin, so more serotonin gets left in the synapse to keep interacting with the receptors on the surface of your neurons. And so there's more available serotonin, even though there's no more serotonin than there was when the drug was given. That is kind of like, basically disrupting the normal life cycle of oxygen and saying, hey, you've got more oxygen in your bloodstream right now. Never mind, there's no oxygen inside your cells or in your brain, but hey, there's more oxygen in your blood, so that's a good thing. That's very much the same kind of scenario where we've kind of convinced ourselves with serotonin and dopamine, the two major neurotransmitters of the brain. We keep using these drugs to modulate the availability of serotonin and dopamine in one tiny little compartment, ignoring the total body exhaustion that's happening. The reason why the major depression set in, or the anxiety disorders, because there was a drop in the amount of serotonin and dopamine available to that brain. The reason there was a drop is because we consumed antibiotics from our physician or from the environment around us. The numbers are now astounding. One course of antibiotics will increase your risk of anxiety by about 17%, an anxiety attack or generalized anxiety disorder in the next 12 months by 17%. Increase the risk of major depression by 24%. 2 courses of antibiotics in the course of 6 months will increase your risk up to near 45% for either of those conditions. And so we have never told that to our patients as physicians. We prescribe 833 prescriptions for every 1,000 man, woman, and children in the United States, and we've done so for almost 20 years. 833 prescriptions for every 1,000 man, woman, and child in the United States. So we have, and yet not a single one of those consumers is being told we are screwing up the entire foundation of your neurologic system because we're going to drop the amount of serotonin and dopamine made in your gut that will then go to be available for your brain. We don't know that. We don't talk about that. Even when we do know it, we feel trapped. Oh, they have a urinary tract infection. What? We can't figure out another approach than antibiotics to treat urinary tract infections. That's been known forever, that silver, colloidal silvers, and D-mannose and these simple available nutrients to our body completely eliminate the risk of urinary tract infection when used appropriately. And so that reality of we are just so short-sighted as scientists and physicians that, hey, we were handed a pharmaceutical toolbox and we thought that was the entire story. Like, you don't think nature thought about that? You don't think people, avoided urinary tract infections, before the advent of antibiotics? And so it's just a really ridiculous scenario that we've so dumbed ourselves down, so codependent with the pharmaceutical industry and our education to believe that it's the only solution. And it's the highest tech or highest science out there is around these pharmaceutical agents, which are all chemicals, pharmaceutical, derived, which means changed or perturbed from their natural state, which means they're going to have side effects and have negative impact on the human body when taken. And so we're just missing the whole root cause of health, and we're certainly missing the pursuit of health and healing through the belief that the pharmaceutical industry should be any part of that, let alone the foundation of it.
So very quickly, the pharmaceutical becomes very much not the solution, but part of the kind of the chemical toxicity problem, especially in a growing child with growing body and brain. We would be particularly concerned.
Precisely. Yeah, and it's no wonder to an autistic parent listening that I say the microbiome is the most fundamental piece of an autistic injury. You already know your child has a messed up gut. It's one of the most fundamentally obvious things when a child develops an autistic injury. They suddenly can't tolerate any other foods. All they want is refined carbohydrates. They'll eat the goldfish and macaroni and cheese all day long, and they won't touch anything else. And so their preference for food gets dumbed down to the drug effect of the food. And so they're trying to now stimulate their neurotransmitters through the drug response to the fat, salt, sugar combinations rather than the nutrient response and the microbiome production of those neurochemicals. And so the kid switches into drug relationship to their food chain very early on in that injury process. And that's the hardest thing to break an autistic kid out of, is their drug relationship to their food. And so any parent who's struggled to help their child with autism knows the gut is so messed up in my child. Why can't I get it right? Why can't I find the right diet? Why can't I get them to do it? And of course, the GAPS diet and some of these early efforts that were really created by parents of autistic kids and the clinicians caring for them realized that nutrition was going to be an important part of the reversal process. And yet that doesn't get told by neurologists or family doctors diagnosing autism. That doesn't get presented as this is front line. You got to change the microbiome. You got to change the nutrients going into the child. Right. Not taught. And so again and again, we've just found that the education that we receive as physicians is so far down the pharmaceutical belief system that we have no understanding or underpinnings, and we're certainly extremely insecure about our lack of knowledge about things like nutrition, exercise, and healthy lifestyles.
Right. Absolutely. And so just kind of tying the abuse of pharmaceuticals to something else that you were referencing earlier, a huge belief in psychiatry, and again, I know this is true in all of medicine, is that these alleged discrete psychiatric disorders are driven by a vulnerable genome, and that we want to move towards this kind of individualized medicine where each and every one of us will be genetically profiled, and then we'll find the perfect drug combination, or we will somehow slice and dice the genome that we were born with and find optimal health. And if you could just kind of speak to that belief system.
Sure. That was definitely the promise I was told when I started medical school in the 1990s. I was told, I'd be the first generation of doctors that would be able to have this power at our fingertips to sequence the genome of every patient walking in the door and tell them exactly what diseases they were going to get and exactly what drugs we were going to use to treat them to the best optimal state. That was a promise right up until about 1996 when we finished decoding the human genome for the first time and ended up with an estimate of about 25,000 genes. That didn't make any sense to our current understanding of genomics because we knew that we had over 250,000 proteins in the human body that were made from genes. So how could just a mere 25,000 genes make 250,000 proteins? Really disrupted our understanding of genomics at the time. We thought that one gene would make one messenger RNA, which would then leave the nucleus and go into the cytoplasm of the cell, orient little amino acids along that RNA that would then turn into a solid protein that would then fold into a complex tertiary protein structure that would then go to be an enzyme or a structural protein or whatever it needed to do. That got blown apart by this reality that we only have, this handful of genes. We had already decoded the genome of the flea, for example. The flea has 30,000 genes. So we were less complicated than a flea at the genetic level. It didn't make any sense. And so when the initial team got done sequencing, everybody else said, you screwed up. You missed most of the genes there. And so then a second team finished, a third team finished. Now we've had 6 teams around the globe, and the number hasn't increased. In fact, it's decreased to find out that we really only have 20,000 genes. So we're 2/3 as complicated as that flea. A fruit fly has 13,000 genes. So we fall somewhere between a fruit fly and a flea in regard to our genetic complexity. That's
very humbling.
Really humbling and difficult to understand. Mm-hmm. And it's been all of the other stuff. So it turns out that only those 20,000 genes represent such a small amount of our DNA that it's now thought that only 1.5% of our DNA actually codes for a gene. The other 98.5% is been considered junk DNA. Literally junk. You can still read articles written this year referring to all of that DNA that doesn't make for a gene as junk DNA that's left over from our evolutionary process or some other justification for all this junk that's survived. But the reality is we already know that we're passing that junk on very carefully to our children. So if it was just junk, why would we preserve it so carefully at the biologic level? Well, in the last few years, we've gotten the answer in that all of that junk DNA is not junk at all. It's actually the template not for proteins. It's the template for microRNA. MicroRNA are much different than messenger RNA. Messenger RNA are the ones that will go become a template for the DNA gene that will then leave and make a protein. MicroRNA are tiny, tiny little segments of nucleotides that are being coded from the previously discussed junk DNA, and those leave the nucleus and leave the cell. And they go on to communicate with distant cell populations and, amazingly, we now know distant species. And so our microRNA is the way in which we genomically communicate with the microbiome. In the same way, it's the way in which the microbiome communicates to our genome. And so some 35 to 40% of the microRNA that's in our bloodstream right now has already been identified to be bacterial or fungal in nature. Wow. When we finally finish, figuring out the microbiome and the scale of its genomics and all of its microRNA, we're going to find out that 99.9% of the microRNA in our bloodstream is actually not from the human. It's actually from the microbiome itself. So what does the microRNA do? If we have all of this genomic information from the microbiome, what is it doing to our genes? It turns out that microRNA then goes down into the nucleus of our cells and can modify the behavior of the gene. And it would have to allow for one gene to make over 200 different protein options, which we now know is the case. And so if one gene can become 200 different things, we need to know what to make at any given moment. So the way that the genome within each of your human cells, 70 trillion cells trying to decide at any given minute, what do I need to make right now? The information that's coming in is coming in the form primarily from the microRNA, as well as other epigenetic factors, chemical exposures. All this can also change the methylation patterns of the epigenetics of our genome. And so now we know that the microbiome, the world around us, is affecting, through their genomics, changing who we become today. We have plasticity not just at the brain, as I discussed earlier. We have plasticity in our whole body. With 70 trillion cells, we can decide at any given moment to build 4 million different bodies. We're so plastic, we can literally build 4 million different variations of ourselves based on the environment that we put around us today. And you've seen people do this. You go to a high school reunion or something like that, and there's going to be a few people in there, they're like, whoa, what happened to you? You were like the fat kid, and now you're like ripped, and they look like the best athlete in the whole class, and your facial structure looks different, and you exude this confidence level that you never had in high school. What happened to you? Well, what happened is that person simply built a different body for themselves, built a different brain by changing their environment dramatically. The cool kids that were at the height of the pecking order at the end of high school, they tend to be the ones that declined over time the fastest because they didn't change their environment, because they had no need to change because they were at the top of the pecking order. And so they've been declining and haven't reinvented their body because they haven't changed their environment. And so this is the revenge of the nerds, I think. This is actually, we're at the bottom of the class, and we were always the last to be picked on teams and everything else. I was definitely in that kind of nerdy category growing up, and struggled to find my social niche in school, and finally found my group of nerds that I got to hang out with through, and we were so nerdy that once we found each other, we couldn't leave each other. So we had to stay best friends for 20 years because there was nobody else nerdy enough to hang out. And so that group, you look at me, you look at pictures of me even from 5 years ago, I'm a different human being than I was then because I keep changing my environment, and I keep more dramatically affecting who I become tomorrow. And I get more and more empowered through that capacity. And we need to pass that hope on to our children, because our children are sick right now, but they don't need to be sick. If they are empowered to change their environment and given the tools to do so, they will change their environment, because nobody wants to be sick. Most of all, a vibrant child who has the potential to become, a real participant in society at large. Instead, as you mentioned earlier, and you asked me to speak on it, I got distracted and didn't mention it. What are we doing with the pharmacy on our children? Instead of empowering them to build a new brain and a new body through changing into a healthy environment around them, we instead pharmaceuticalize them. 70% of the children that are diagnosed with ADHD by the age of 12 are medicated with a stimulant. They're medicated with Ritalin, Adderall, these versions of speed. These are literally adrenaline forcing hormones that will turn on the fight or flight state in the child. The advantage of the fight or flight state is you become focused, and that's exactly why we're giving it to the kid, is because they can't focus in school. They can't take a multiple choice test. They can't do this or that. Oh, well, just give them speed. It'll put them in a fight or flight state. They're going to have to focus for a few minutes so that they can answer the ridiculous 4 options they have on that multiple choice test. And so both by our testing and education method and by the drugs, we are stealing away and crushing the creativity of that organism, because a child or any being that's under a fight or flight state will naturally turn off its creative centers of the brain for self-protection. If you suddenly have a threat to your life and you're in a fight or flight reaction, it's a terrible moment to sit down and decide you're going to compose a poem or draw a painting. We naturally and appropriately turn off our creative centers when we're in a fight or flight state. Now we have a whole social structure and pharmaceutical structure that forces our children at a very young age into these fight or flight states pharmaceutically, where they can't escape that fight or flight state. They lose their creativity. They can't find their purpose because they can't find a creative outlet that would allow them to express their unique purpose among us. And they get depressed, they get anxious, and they feel overwhelmed, and they can't adjust to society because they are being crushed down in their potential by the very pharmaceutical environment we put them into.
Absolutely. And so while the statistics are really depressing and deeply alarming, and the pharmaceutical industry right now carries so much power, and as you were saying, medical education is so limited and is not kind of teaching the kinds of things that you're expressing to us today. Your message is nonetheless an extremely optimistic message, because what you're saying is that we're not just products of our genome. In fact, the genome plays a very limited role. The microbiome, in collaboration with, good planetary health, is what enables us to take charge of our health and take charge of our lives. And so I'm wondering if you could make some recommendations to either parents who are concerned about their children who have received these diagnoses of ADHD or depression or autism, or just individuals who themselves are struggling, who are depressed, who are anxious, who are sick. How would you suggest that they build a better brain and build a better body? What steps can we all take to do this?
Thank you for that question. It's so important. I mean, I want to infuse hope into all of you. If you haven't caught it yet, you can build yourself a new body and brain. That is such an important story for you and your children and grandchildren, nieces, nephews, et cetera, that are suffering right now. And so it's so exciting. We have so much human potential untapped because we have never really lived life in a sense and a wonderment of connection to nature as a society. Individuals, I think, have gotten there. We can point to individuals who found real nurture and kind of synergy with Mother Nature, and maybe through a meditation process or some other experience. Near-death experiences are very common to do this, where somebody will have a near-death experience and spend time on the other side of the veil for 20 minutes and then suddenly come back into the body, and they completely change their whole perspective on their connection with nature. Or ayahuasca is another common one you hear about, people doing ayahuasca journey, and suddenly through the influence of the chemicals and the roots of those plants that are used in the ayahuasca journey disrupts neurochemistry to the point where you suddenly see the singularity. You suddenly realize you're all connected to the trees and the air around you, and the moisture in the air, and all of this stuff is all singularity. Those experiences can accelerate that. But in many ways, small and large, you can start to move yourself to that recognition that you are connected to nature at a fundamental level of the fabric that you are created from, and you have the ability to build a new body. You have the ability to transform yourself, and you do not need a pharmaceutical industry to do that. You do not need a doctor to do that. You do not need anything outside of yourself and the context of the nature that you were born into to achieve a huge paradigm leap in human health, who you are, get connected to not only who you are, but what you're here to do. And so that process looks a lot like getting nature back into your life. And so first, getting the silence in your life. Turn off the freaking TVs, turn off your computer, turn off the Wi-Fi, get some silence in the house. If you can't get in the house, then just leave the house, get in your car and drive as far away from civilization as you can, and get out of the car. I don't care if it's in the middle of a field or by a waterfall or whatever, and stare at a leaf for a while, stare into nature for just a few minutes, and find reconnection there. Have you felt that incredible sensation of grass on your toes recently? Bare feet in grass, and especially the opportunity to be in a field that's got like wildflowers growing there and everything else. And you can feel like the crumbliness of the soil beneath your feet, and you can feel the tickle and pressure of the grass and the leaves of the flowers pushing up on your ankles and toes and everything else. It's a real life, like 4-dimensional massage happening from Mother Nature into all of your neurologic systems. The bottom of your foot is the reflexology map. Every single organ in your body can be nourished and nurtured and encouraged and inspired by the touch of just grass on the bottom of the feet. If you're in a park, that grass has been sprayed with glyphosate recently, and you're going to absorb chemicals in your body. So get out into real nature. Get out into the wildflowers. Get out there into the real grasses of the Midwest. Get out there to the sands of our beaches that are certainly contaminated, but still have the power to touch you back to Mother Earth. So that's the starting of the process for you and your children. If you feel sick, then stop whatever you're doing. If you need to pull your kids out of school for 2 weeks, if you need to take sick leave, do whatever you need to do to create a few days of nature for your children and for yourself. Get out there, go on a canoe trip, do something to get yourselves and your children back into nature. You'll have scratches, you'll have bug bites, you'll have bumps and bruises. You will be interacting with nature intimately. There will be an exchange of blood and microbes and an exchange of microRNA just by sitting outside and breathing and experiencing nature and letting nature touch you. Don't go out there and spray yourself down with bug spray instantly and cover yourself with sunscreen and all that. At least give yourself a few minutes of real, uninhibited, unfiltered nature. An incredible study is being done in Africa right now with the Hadza tribe. It's the last of the hunter and gatherers on the planet. And they've shown that their microbiome is hundreds of times more complex than our our ecosystem or microbiome is in the developed world. And interestingly, their microbiome is bulletproof. Missionaries have this habit of going through Africa and dropping off antibiotics and other medications to say, hey, if you get sick, just take these, as if they would have any idea of what sick is first, and that they would have any idea of why or for how long or whatever they would take these pills. And so the Hadza people will just eat these things at the campfire that night because it's a shiny bottle from the West and they feel like it's technology. So they'll start popping pills, they'll hand these things around, and the study group isn't allowed to intervene at all. And so they just have to, their only allowance scientifically is to measure the ecosystem of the Hadza tribe, no matter what they do, no matter what they eat, no matter what they do. And so they were terrified and just devastated emotionally to see these antibiotics show up from all these missionaries. And to watch these Hadza people who have maybe the last microbiome in existence chowing on these antibiotics, they were devastated, and then they were totally dumbstruck when they did the follow-up analysis of the microbiome to find out that the Hadza people hadn't even budged their microbiome by those antibiotics. What? They hadn't even, there was zero change in their microbiome by eating antibiotics for the first time. How is that possible? It's possible because they are so tied into their greater macro ecosystem that they're just an extension of the planet. The antibiotic hit them, but it didn't hit the ecosystem around them. A huge amount of the species of the microbiome that have been found to be existing and thriving in the human gut of the Hadza tribe are actually isolated from nature only on the hides of zebras and porcupine and these other animals that they hunt and consume. On their hides, not even in their gut or anything else, so that they're touching the animals they kill and eat to the degree that that would so populate their ecosystem. And so how do you heal your child in the era of antibiotics when the water's full of antibiotics, everything's full of antibiotics? You get them so tied back into nature that they're simply an extension of the greater ecosystem, and they will become bulletproof. Like the Hadza people, we can become bulletproof if we spend enough time outside. Get naked. Have you skinny dipped recently? Like, isn't that a freaking magical process? Like, get the cloth off you, get all the chemical infused polyesters off your body, get that bathing suit off of you, and let Mother Nature touch your skin. It's nurturing, it's sexy, it's erotic. It's like nature wants to caress your body. Nature wants to be present with you on that level. And we disrupt it. We put 1,000 filters between us and the potential microbiome and the ecosystem around us. And the result is a very narrow reality of our biologic ecosystem, which makes us very vulnerable to injury from antibiotics, from the chemicals that we would consume and everything else. And so our vulnerability is as much from our convenience lifestyle as it is from the drugs in our environment.
Well, thank you so much for those amazing, the amazing science that you have presented and your recommendations. And again, this wonderful big picture that you afford us about the nature of human health. This has been wonderful, and thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate this. You guys are part of an information stream now, and just as the microbiome communicates, I trust that you all will go and communicate this. Thank you for being part of that information highway to get us to a higher consciousness.
Okay. Take care.